Authoritarian leaders are uniquely and keenly aware of the freedom of speech associated with these public spaces, which allows individuals to voice their grievances, challenge existing power structures, and they will use tactics like surveillance, like censorship and repression to restrict the political activities that occur there, to suppress the voices.
Over the past few decades, the U.S. has seen a gradual move towards the privatization of space because of a greater dependency on private capital to create public spaces. This has meant that there are fewer and fewer places for people to gather and make a significant impact without avoiding disruption.
The size of a space, the accessibility, how easy is it for people to get to it, the symbolism of that particular location, maybe it's a historically important square where things have happened before, so anything that happens there kind of carries some weight. All those things are factors to consider when we look at the relationship between protest and public space.
Hello and welcome to a special edition of The Urbanist, part one of our three-part series on conflict and the city. I'm your host, Andrew Tuck. Throughout centuries, war and violence have shaped our cities from activism to active fighting to the aftermath of such events. In this episode, we explore protests, their effect on the built environment, and how activism is itself shaped by the public realm. Professor Geoffrey Howe is the head of the Department of Architecture at National University of Singapore and in 2017 published the book City Unsilenced, Urban Resistance and Public Space in the Age of Shrinking Democracy. And this examines the spaces in which neoliberal practices have impacted the life of citizens and communities around the globe. Professor Howe joined Monocle's David Stevens a little earlier to discuss the book, what has changed since publishing, and how the interaction between public space and activism affects our so-called shrinking democracy today.
The City Unsilenced book really came out of an observation that we have seen a growing number of protests around the world. This is not the first time. I mean, throughout history, you have seen kind of reoccurrence of waves of protests. And at the time when we were working on this book, we were seeing sort of another wave, and we're interested in finding out what are the commonality among these protests. And one of the things we have noticed is that a lot of these protests are really kind of responding to economic restructuring of neoliberalism, and also what we call the shrinking democracy is reflected in lack of kind of representation in the political process, which is why people are taking their voices to the streets.
And we see a bit clearer, I think, how protests can transform the public space, especially in the present when they're going on. It restricts access and there's response from policing and things like that. But can we look at the other way, maybe how a public space or the public realm affects how a protest might play out, might be planned, how actually the design of a space can affect how people protest within it?
Yeah, there's a lot of factors that come into how public space either supports or recruits protests. And design is an important part of it. The size of a space, the accessibility, how easy is it for people to get to it, the symbolism of that particular location. Maybe it's a historically important square where things have happened before. So anything that happens there kind of carries some weight. And so all those things are factors to consider when we look at the relationship between protest and public space.
And more recently, perhaps, the prevalence of privately owned public space has become a big part in how public our cities actually are, and therefore where people are able to protest. Have you seen these spaces grow in number recently over the past 7 years since you published your book? And how is that affecting how protests are playing out on our streets?
Yeah, the privatization of public space has been a process that's been going on for quite some time. So it's not just within the last few years, but definitely I think within the last few years we have seen a continued growth in that trend. In part, it reflects just how dependent cities these days are on private investments, private capital to kind of support continued operation of parks and open space. But also interestingly, during Occupy Wall Street, the reason why the movement was able to kind of take place in New York was actually the availability of a privately owned public space that doesn't have the usual constraint when it comes to parks. And therefore, it was not kind of regulated in the same way. So at least in the beginning, people were able to camp out on Scotty Park. because it doesn't have the same kind of regulation as a typical park and open space. But I think what we have seen in recent times is that there's sort of pushback. We are seeing kind of growing restriction, the kind of activity that happen, not just in the typical kind of public space, but also in privately owned public space. And so we're losing more of the kind of opportunity for people to engage in freedom of assembly, freedom of speech.
Staying in the US and staying on that kind of issue of privately owned public space, I wanted to look at a few examples, and the most present one, I suppose, at the moment is the protests happening in US college campuses. What are we seeing play out there, and how is that story even more complicated because you're involving a university within that equation?
That's a great question. I think what makes the situation complicated and unique in some way is because these campuses, some of them are private spaces. So for example, Columbia University is a private university. So the university can basically exclude members of the public who are not students or faculty from entering the university. So it creates this kind of disconnect between the university and the larger public. And university have used that as an excuse to control what can happen on campus. I mean, in some way, it helps to kind of protect the students. And so this is a very kind of tricky situation where you have a control space for protests that is very different from the kind of typical public space, the streets, the plaza, and so forth. So that's kind of what is kind of making the current situation somewhat unique.
We will return to our conversation with Professor Jeffrey Howe shortly, but first, we enlisted the help of New York-based journalist Karina Choi to give us an update on the United States college campus protests and to assess how cities around the US allow for or restrict public protest. Karina sent us this report.
Protests calling for U.S. universities to divest from firms supporting Israel's war in Gaza have spread across the country, prompting police to remove and arrest students who've set up encampments and occupied university property over the past few weeks. At Columbia, just a few blocks away from where I'm based in Morningside Heights, a peaceful encampment erected by pro-Palestinian protesters was raided by police in late April, after university administrators called for external enforcement 2 days into the protests.
Tonight, NYPD officers descending on Columbia University, arresting dozens of pro-Palestinian protesters.
I'm just sitting here. Why are you doing this to me?
Police, some in riot gear, moving in.
Columbia's decision sparked intense backlash from people all over the country and triggered a nationwide debate on how colleges should handle protests against the war in Gaza, a conflict that has sown deep divisions in politics, classrooms, and households. With Columbia unwilling to divest from Israel, protesters broke in and camped out in a university building called Hamilton Hall. 2 days later, on a rainy Tuesday evening, they were forcibly removed by hundreds of police in a spectacle that shocked the world. That evening, I watched arrested students get bussed out of Morningside Heights, their masked faces pressed against the tinted windows as they passed their peers on the streets. On the other side of the street, I also watched several dozen police with batons and shields in their hand leave Columbia's campus, but it wouldn't be the last time.
We have protested the use of the university to support the war in Vietnam.
It wasn't so long ago when another generation of Columbia students organized similar encampments to protest the Vietnam War and the university's ties to South Africa. These movements also ended with clashes between protesters and police, but are now celebrated in Columbia's archives as brave acts of defiance. In the United States, the freedom to peacefully assemble is enshrined in the Constitution, but how authorities have pushed back on recent encampments is also related to the limits of public space. Under the First Amendment, peaceful, non-discriminatory protests are allowed on university grounds, but schools have the right to impose time, place, and manner restrictions on large gatherings and encampments, especially on campuses that fall in a gray area between public and private space. Experts I spoke with say these types of spaces give authorities leeway to police people who occupy them. They said that recent encampments are not protected under free speech because they are acts of civil disobedience. Universities can use the argument that protests are disrupting public order and those putting their bodies on the line would risk arrest. So how does a country that believes in freedom of assembly allow room for peaceful protests? Well, it's tricky. Over the past few decades, the US has seen a gradual move towards the privatization of space because of a greater dependency on private capital to create public spaces. This has meant that there are fewer and fewer places for people to gather and make a significant impact without avoiding disruption. Some urban planners see this move towards privatization as a way to ensure order in public areas, but others see it as a need to create spaces that are more inclusive to this generation's needs. Some of the largest protests in recent memory have already started shaping urban design. In Washington, D.C., a 2-block-long pedestrian section in the heart of the city was renamed Black Lives Matter Plaza, after months of summer protests against the killing of George Floyd.
It's more fair and more just, and that Black lives and Black humanity matter in our nation.
The intersection where Floyd was killed in South Minneapolis has also turned into a public memorial, where people are invited to gather around murals and sculptures. This move to make urban design more inclusive has also been inspired by the removal of Confederate statues in squares and plazas across some southern states, so that people of different cultural groups and backgrounds feel more welcome in these shared spaces. As students wrap up their semesters and Columbia remains unwavering in its decision to keep ties to Israel, I'll be watching to see whether campus protests will spill out onto the streets, and how this might shape or change the urban landscape of New York City.
My thanks there to Karina Choi in New York. We return now to our conversation between David Stevens and Professor Jeffrey Howe.
Looking at another one of the modern conflicts at the moment, Russia's war on Ukraine, and looking at how protest occurs within Russia, is there design that's being put forward, or is there a history of design that is meant to restrict people from voicing their opinions in Russia?
A lot of the socialist urban planning, you create this kind of really large scale public space. So it takes a lot of people to congregate to make it an effective expression or to engage in any kind of public dissent. It's much easier to do so, for example, in New York City, going back to our example of Occupy Wall Street. It's a very limited space. It doesn't require a lot of people. So you can easily create a condition where you can see people together engage in civil disobedience or unrest. And it has the effect of kind of bringing more people to the site. Whereas in a lot of the kind of socialist planned cities, it's much harder to do that because the spaces are so sparse and it takes a lot more effort to occupy that amount of space.
To tell us more about how activism in Russia plays out in public spaces, we were joined earlier by Dr. Alexis Lerner, author of Post-Soviet Graffiti, Free Speech in Authoritarian States, which is out later this year via University of Toronto Press.
Overall, the state of protesting in Russia has changed so much over the last decade. There was this massive opening at the beginning of the 21st century, especially around 2005, 2009, 2011. There were these massive protests where people would come by the tens of thousands into the street in cities like Moscow and St. Petersburg. And it was a very exciting time. I was there myself. I was at these protests. I saw Navalny on stage. And after, I would say, 2012, but really increasing by 2014, 2015, there was this intentional closing and tightening of the Russian collective political identity that took place by Kremlin design. And by the time the pandemic hit and then the second invasion of Ukraine by the Kremlin, there was really a almost complete crackdown on traditional forms of protest, street demonstration. So these rallies do exist, but the consequences today for participating are sizable and in many ways dissuade your average protester from continuing to participate. While the protests in Moscow and St. Petersburg have generally received the most attention, there has been an increase in grassroots activism and regional protests across Russia. These smaller ways of expressing dissent, for example, on social media platforms like Telegram and Instagram, of course, in graffiti, as I write about in my book. But the Russian government has ultimately responded by implementing strict regulations on online speech, targeting digital activists with harassment, surveillance, even jail time. And so ultimately, with the death of Alexei Navalny in 2024, just a few months ago, the government has essentially completed its crackdown, at least on these large-scale events, created a climate of fear, intimidation. Many activists have been forced underground to operate, or in fact, they seek asylum abroad. Urban design, specifically in Russia and other socialist countries, plays this significant role in shaping the possibilities for protests in public spaces. For instance, wide boulevards, large open spaces in some of these cities like Moscow and St. Petersburg indeed make it easier for authorities to monitor and control demonstrations. For example, they provide fewer hiding spots for protesters. They give fewer opportunities for crowds to gather out of sight. But the layout of the cities also makes it easier for police to quickly disperse crowds, to block access to key government buildings, and also public spaces. I saw this myself back in 2012 in Moscow. They would line the public squares with basically security gates, metal detectors, and they would put them shoulder to shoulder. But the metal detectors were all closed. They weren't working. So nobody could actually enter the public square, ostensibly because there was some kind of security control situation. And I've also seen public spaces blocked by tanks in Moscow firsthand on the street. Design also matters in terms of infrastructure in large cities. Of course, public transit, restrooms, first aid stations can impact the feasibility and the sustainability of protests. Urban areas with well-developed infrastructure like this are just better equipped to accommodate large gatherings. They provide support for protesters, and conversely, a lack of infrastructure or amenities may pose logistical challenges to participating in these kind of protests. Things like surveillance cameras, police checkpoints, security barriers, all of these influence the perceived safety and freedom of expression in urban spaces. I've seen, again, firsthand, excessive surveillance, heavy security measures that intimidate protesters and discourage dissent. I've seen protesters picked off at random from large demonstrations, peaceful demonstrations. And while major cities like Moscow and St. Petersburg offer these prominent public spaces, these big boulevards, and so on, they are often heavily surveyed and tightly controlled by the authorities. And smaller cities, of course, have more limited public spaces, which make it challenging for dissenting voices to gather and be heard. However, the individuals are also perhaps more visible by the authorities because there are just fewer people there to protest. Free speech in Russia operates in a similar way as it might in other autocratic states. In a democratic state, for example, public space is this place for free expression. Public squares, neighborhood bars, parade grounds, these are all neutral, informal, voluntary, inclusive spaces. They lack exclusive membership requirements. They serve as platforms where people can get together and communicate and engage in all kinds of activities, including, of course, political discussions and protests. Authoritarian leaders like Putin and like other autocrats are uniquely and keenly aware of the freedom of speech associated with these public spaces, which allows individuals to voice their grievances, challenge existing power structures. And they will use tactics like surveillance, like censorship and repression to restrict the political activities that occur there, to suppress the voices that are present in the public spaces. And they may even go as far as to criminalize certain behaviors or even individuals or groups to exclude them from participating in public spaces. So that not only increases the autocratic government's power, but also limits the power of their opposition. So if people can't necessarily always get together and march together collectively, raising banners, shouting slogans, what they have to do is find alternative avenues of free expression. And one of those that I'm interested in is graffiti. I believe that graffiti thrives as this anonymous and subversive medium that allows individuals who are otherwise marginalized to voice their dissent and critique power dynamics. This is something that occurs in the public space because of its anonymous nature. It is accessible to all kinds of different voices, a variety of voices on political issues and policies that may be present in that space. Graffiti is this potent form of political expression, particularly in the face of restrictive government control over public discourse. And despite the risks of speaking out against the government, we have these clandestine graffiti artists who are infiltrating urban environments, using the walls and public spaces as canvases for their messages of protest and critique. And so while I've seen this change over time, and back in 2011, 2012, graffiti artists were writing about Putin and about Viktor Orban and Lukashenko, and writing about these autocratic leaders in a way that was truly critical. And as time changes, as the Russian state becomes more arguably closed to public forms of protest, the types of graffiti and the size of different messages, the language in which it occurs, the messages that are within, those actually change over time. And we go from hearing very explicit political critiques to today more nuanced no to war, or even an image of something, for example, a picture of a bear that is supposed to symbolize maybe the Russian state being aggressive toward a map of Georgia, for example. So we have these sort of more nuanced ways of understanding. The actual images get quite small. I write about this in an article in Comparative Political Studies, is that we have the Kremlin producing these 6-story murals and actually flooding artists out of the public spaces. So their artworks are not only no longer in the downtown area, but they're also very small. They're just not able to express this political sentiment in a way that can really challenge the regime's narrative. They are quite literally dwarfed by the Kremlin's murals in Russia today.
My thanks to Dr. Alexis Lerner there, and we return now to Professor Geoffrey Howe in conversation with David Stevens.
What's interesting about Gezi Park, and you can see similar things in other movements as well, is how people are able to kind of self-organize activities, not limited to the sort of hardcore protesters. So there are others, general public, doing other activities that may appeal to a particular group. So, for example, parents with children are able to come and participate because they find similar audience there. And artists can come in, create their own work. Architects were there to document the structure that the activists have created. So compared to the more organized kind of form of protest led by a smaller group of people, what's happened in Gezi Park and other similar examples that you see of a much wider variety of activity that are self-organized, that enable people to come and have sort of a sense of belonging in the movement, because these are activities and events that are created by people themselves.
Here now with more on the setting of the 2013 Gezi Park protests, Taksim Gezi Square, and how the urban environment and public space have transformed during demonstrations within it, is our correspondent in Istanbul, Hannah Lucinda Smith.
In the middle of Istanbul sits an expanse of concrete with an oasis of green at its heart. Taksim Square, more a convergence point than a place in itself, the end point of the boulevards and back alleys that come at it from all directions, and a symbol of resistance and power. Its style is a mishmash, brutalist hotels and office blocks looming over two sides, the spaceship-like new mosque on another, and facing that, the ultra-modern Ataturk Cultural Centre. Taksim's history is squeezed between the new, like the crosses on top of the domes of the ancient churches, now peeping up behind the minarets and electricity poles. The square was built around the monument to the Turkish Republic that stands at the centre, depicting the founders of Turkey looking out over the beating heart of the country they built, and the protests and political displays that have rocked it. Taksim was drenched in blood in 1969, when nationalist mobs attacked protesting leftist students, and again in 1977, when 34 protesters were killed during May Day demonstrations. It was doused in tear gas during the Gezi Park protests of 2013, so much tear gas that Istanbulis on the Asian side of the city could see the noxious clouds rising from the hill that Taksim sits on top of. It is hung with huge banners and flags several times a year for Turkey's 5 annual national days. It was drenched in 25 tonnes of rosewater in 2021 during the celebrations for the opening of the new mosque. Taksim moulds itself around protest. When I first came to Istanbul as a tourist in 2008, the square was actually a giant roundabout, with taxis perambulating the monument, which was surrounded by uninspiring snippets of flower beds with nowhere to sit. By the time I moved to the city in 2013, the square had been redeveloped and pedestrianised. Now a smooth wave of people flows from Istiklal, the mile-long shopping boulevard, into Taksim, 35,000 square metres of smooth, interrupted space. A space that was perfect for demonstrations. In May 2013, the government announced plans to redevelop Gezi, that small oasis in the heart of Taksim, and one of the only parks in the city centre. Within days, small protests had erupted into a mass sit-in in the square, complete with libraries, protest art and music. Erdogan ordered a crackdown, and the police stormed in with water cannon and rubber bullets. For days on end, the demonstrators played cat and mouse with the cops, ducking down alleyways and popping back up through others to keep coming back into Taksim. When that summer of protest was over, Erdogan set to work transforming the square. He pushed ahead with plans for a huge new mosque, a symbol of resurgent religion at the heart of secular Turkey. Taksim's pubs and clubs began closing as the country was hit by a wave of terrorism and political chaos, and the tourists stayed away. An economic crisis bruised Taksim further, but in recent years it has undergone a revival as the pulling point for tourists from the Arab world who now flock here. Hookah joints and baklava shops have sprung up to serve them. 11 years on from Gezi, protest is de facto banned in Turkey, and when events are expected, Taksim becomes a no-go zone. Local governors have the power to ban gatherings on any pretext, and on Women's Day and May the 1st, the square is swaddled in rings of police barricades, and all local public transport is halted. For hours, it's a vast void in the middle of the metropolis. But in the back streets, holding placards and gas masks, the protesters are still there, determined to find their way back to Taksim. For Monocle, in Istanbul, I'm Hannah Lucinda-Smith.
Thanks, Hannah. And here with the final word is Professor Geoffrey Howe again.
When we were working on the book, this is back in 2015, we had no idea that Donald Trump would be elected. And similarly, other right-wing politicians getting elected in other places around the world. So this has been the trend, especially in the last few years. And so I would say that the democracy is in crisis in many ways. The influence of social media on the outcome of elections, the society becoming kind of more and more polarized. So these are additional challenges that we actually did not foresee when we were working on a book. So in some way, I think the shrinking democracy is a continued phenomenon. Although we're also seeing people getting organized and push back against the situation. But I think the larger structural kind of challenges in many ways has elevated over the last few years.
Professor Geoffrey Howe there in conversation with David Stevens. And my thanks to both of them. And that's all for this episode of The Urbanist. Next week, we explore what comes after violence and discuss rebuilding efforts, both past and future.
Reconstruction often comes with the symbolic meaning of a new chapter, a new phase, an opportunity sometimes, a sense of radical hope, but it's so hard to capture this radical hope today in a time where people even cannot grieve publicly inside the country, when their story is muted and silenced and they are unable even to tell what happened to their loved ones, or to tell that I lost my son or daughter or father or mother.
The Urbanist is produced by Carlotta Rebello and by David Stevens, who also edits the show. This episode was guest produced by Christy O'Grady. I'm Andrew Tuck. Goodbye, and thank you for listening, City Lovers.